Sure. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Hasina Badani. I'm a research manager at IPA, and I've been there for 3 years, primarily working on the research transparency and now the data ethics work for the organization. And I'm really sorry I can't be there in person, but I'm happy to attend via remote. So just to start off, so we actually began the Research Transparency Initiative in 2013, where we primarily ensured computational reproducibility of project data for IPA studies by using a standardized process, which includes following a folder structure and making sure that the data sets were rid of any kind of PII or even indirect PII. And we posted this data to our Dataverse repository. But in the meantime, we began to see trends change as to how the requirement of sharing data changed the research transparency landscape. And many of the curations we were encountering needed a faster and faster turnaround cycle. We were getting data before the publication deadline, and primarily because we were the PIs were beholden to the requirements of their donor to either share clean data with them directly, or they were beholden to the requirements of the publisher to provide the digital object identifier, or the DOI, of the data materials in an online repository before paper publication. So some examples are PLOS One, which was one of the first journals where we encountered that. And then, of course, more recently with the AEA journals and their data and code requirements. So now that data in itself doesn't have ethical implications, but it's what you do with the data that does. So meanwhile, as we were doing this work, serendipitously in 2018, our team acquired the IRB administration work for IPA, where we saw how the data is collected and how it's protected, as well as how it's used. And so, of course, there are ethical implications to this work, and we immediately saw how these ethical tenets translated to our research transparency work. So just as an overview, and I'm sure you've seen this from your human subject certificate training, the IRB work is guided by these three tenets of ethical human subjects research. So justice, beneficence, and the respect for persons. But again, these tenets, at least we see, go beyond human subjects research. And I'll leave these up here, but I'm sure you know them. We saw in our informed consent templates that we were asking project teams to include information about how identifiable data will not be shared outside the organization, and statements about maintaining confidentiality and how respondent data will be secured and protected according to IP's data security protocols. So these were things that we were already discussing and handling with our transparency work, and now we got to see it through the lens of the IRB review process, which was interesting for us. And then, as you may know, on May 25th, 2018, we were subject to GDPR, or the EU General Data Protection Regulations, in which some of our EU PIs were not allowed to work with identifiable data. So to assist our project staff who were affected by these changes, IP's Chief Information Officer, who was also delegated as the organization's data protection officer role, worked with our general counsel to make sure that IPA was complying with their data privacy laws. And then this was done as a coordinated effort with our RT team, or our RT team, because from the IRB side, we needed to make sure that our informed consent clauses and template language reflected this. But then from the research transparency side, we needed to make clear IPA's role in the data use process. So for example, we had a discussion with the legal team at the University of Oxford to determine whether IPA was a collaborator or a processor, which essentially meant an outsourced contractor. And they determined that as a collaborator, it would have allowed us more flexibility in the agreement. So for example, the ability to develop protocols that comply with GDPR together with PIs from Oxford. But as a processor, we would have had to accept and comply with the agreement as written, since Oxford could dictate all of the terms of the engagement, including deletion of the data once collected. And so we made the argument that IPA was more of a collaborator rather than a processor, because in accordance with agreeing to work with us, which was in pursuit of our mission, the IPA will retain the data for research transparency purposes, and that we would add value to the project as well as to the data collection and processing of the data for the project. And ultimately, it was determined we were collaborators, and we were able to demonstrate that we'll need the data we're collecting from the study for academic and non-commercial purposes. And so we shared a couple documents with them, including our data sharing guidelines. And so as a result, being introduced to the inner workings of the IRB and then the regulation changes provided by laws like GDPR, we were able to reinforce our curation standardization process for data publication, because we were doing things like triple checking that we were properly anonymizing data. And so with all of these changes, we realized that this was an opportunity to revamp our team. And that's when we changed our name to Research Transparency, Data Ethics and Governance Team, or RTDEG. And we were previously known as the Research Transparency Initiative. So that's what happened with that shift. And we took this opportunity to streamline the IRB process so it addressed more concerns about what was being done with the data and how it was being used after publication. So some of the things that we did was we first modified a lot of our protocol forms so that teams would tell us what they're doing with things like GPS coordinates, even if it was just a quality assurance exercise, because sometimes teams used it to retain locations for follow-up studies. And our board was very happy to have that new inclusion in our original application forms, just because one particular board member was very keen about understanding what was happening with these GPS coordinates. And then additionally, with the changes in the common rule, which happened earlier this year, we updated our informed consent form checklist and template to include a statement about whether participants' information might or will not be stripped of identifiers and be used for future research, and then an additional statement containing information about possible commercial profit if it's applicable. And then regarding broad consent, which gives an option to get consent from subjects when you collect identifiable information for potential future use, we had a conversation with our board chair about this and whether we should use this as part of our process. And we decided that there were too many challenges with IPA implementing broad consent, just because you lose the ability to use waiver of consent. And then exemptions also become less specific. So he was okay with us not going forward with the use of broad consent. And then additionally, with our assumed work administering the IRB process, we began asking project teams whether they were considering the data publication process, since that was becoming inevitable with the change in the transparency landscape. And so ultimately, for next steps, we found that while IRBs protect human subjects, which can restrict what data is shared, and research transparency encourages open data and computational reproducibility, we try to have the PIs or RAs use data commands like encode to ensure that the code can run through, but that doesn't always happen to be the case. And we have come across data sets where this isn't possible. And so we provide as much written detail in the README files about what is replicable and what's not. So in all, we've made the decision as an institution to combine the functions of data transparency and data ethics, so the IRB, precisely because the data transparency movement cannot be successful unless how to balance openness with protection of individuals' data and manage those disclosure risks. And so we have and are currently developing tools to address that problem head on. And one of those is a de-identification tool using Python. So as part of the curation process, we still use a state do file to flag potential instances of PII, which we remove per the approval of the PI if those instances are truly instances of PII. However, again, as part of the curation process, we kept track of the time we spent on each data curation task and found that about 30% of our curation time was spent on the de-identification process. So when IPA hired a data scientist, one of the projects we collaborated on was the development of a de-identification tool using Python. And the idea was that we would be able to quickly flag any instances of PII and be able to de-identify it. Unfortunately, he has moved on, and so we still need to wrap up that project, but we hope to have that done quite soon. And so that's what we've been up to so far, and I just wanted to provide my email address if you guys have any questions, because I won't be able to remain on the whole call, but I'm happy to take questions now as well. Thank you.
Great, so we have about 10 minutes for questions and discussion. Just open up the floor. Yeah, hi, Garrett Christensen, Census Bureau. My question is, you mentioned spending 30% of your time in this cleanup process on PI, on finding the PI, but what was the average total time in hours or?
Oh, I need to look up that data again. I essentially just use my own time tracking tool, and then we've institutionalized that across, the other RAs doing that as well. So I need to look that up, and I can get back to you, Garrett. Unfortunately, I don't have that on hand.
This is Florence. I have just a question on this de-identification. So have you guys dealt, and I guess we're going to come to you with that question soon because we have a 3IE grant that's running through IPA and they want all our data, which is, we have these geocoordinates of plots in that study that are essential in defining kind of the running variables we use for regression discontinuity. And then we do a number of things, spatial fixed effects, so we need to know who's in the neighborhood of your cultivated plot, etc. And so kind of for this type of spatial economics analysis, have you guys worked on that at all, or is that work in progress? Like we haven't.
Sorry, so to understand your question, is that have we dealt with any spatial analysis curations?
Yeah, exactly. So when actually the geocode, so you need to know sort of in what referential the objects are that you're studying in order to run your analysis, and in a way that's just sort of spatially contiguous. I mean, this is in the case of like a big infrastructure program, and so it would be quite easy for a, say, government to take a, we couldn't just move people around in space, like do a simple translation, because people know where this infrastructure is placed. So it's not going to be really hard for somebody who wants to locate this plot to do the translation into the right referral and just figure out where people are. So we're super concerned about this, and we're trying to handle this, I guess.
So we've worked on, it was actually recently, we've worked, and it hasn't been posted yet because they're waiting to get published. So that's TBD. But we have worked on one curation where there was spatial analysis. And essentially, we worked with the RA very closely on being able to at least de-identify that data set. But it became such that we could actually drop the GPS data sets because they used other variables to, I guess, it wasn't as necessary for the analysis as we had originally thought. So we tend to work quite closely with the RAs when they're going through the curation process, because for this one, we had actually talked to the RA 2 years ago and given him a heads up, like things that you should keep an eye out for. So at least for this future project with, in coordination with 3IE, that's something we would want to do. But we haven't actually posted anything with spatial analysis data. So I don't have a straight answer for you, but it's something that I'm anticipating will become more common. And so this last curation was kind of a tester. And then eventually we didn't need the GPS coordinates posted. We ended up posting, I think, just the distances, and at that point it was fine for that. We need to work closely with the project team to determine how we would be able to do the curation moving forward.
Hi, Hasina. This is Maria Jones from DIME. A question that we will talk about our work in DIME shortly, but one thing that we've thought a lot about is, putting our guidelines out to be public so that we can kind of have a comparative sense of what de-identification looks like, what different people are doing. And I'm just curious of the sort of processes that your team does, and how much of how much of, sort of your checklists and guidelines do you make publicly available versus keeping them in-house at IPA?
So most of our guidelines are available on our website. The only thing that we haven't made public is actually, it's more for the RAs on the team. It's an internal guide to curation. So a more step-by-step process as to how we post curations on our Dataverse repository. But you can find all of our materials online. We have a best practices guide that you can find, which kind of goes through, what we include in our folder structure, what we consider as instances of PII, potential indirect PII as well. So we try to make that public. Yeah, there's only one guide that we keep internal, really. And that's just to help facilitate our work to make sure that the curations are done properly.
Hello, Hazina. This is Marie Gardner from 3IE. You mentioned that funders are increasingly asking to get the data in code, and I know that 3IE is obviously one of the main funders. But who are the other funders? Are there other funders that are asking for it?
Yes, World Bank has been one of them. DFID, and actually Gates Foundation recently as well. So actually, for those I wouldn't call them curations. We ended up doing PII checks for those data sets because they wanted them. They wanted the project teams to share that data, the raw data, with them, even as data collection was happening. So it was happening in waves. And so those curations have not yet been done because they're still doing data collection.
Okay, anything else from the audience? Otherwise, we can move on to the next one. Great. Thank you very much, Hasina. Sorry you can't be here again, but please stay on as long as you like, and if you want to pop in, just send me a text and we'll get you on the mic. All right.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Have a good day, everyone. All right. Bye-bye.